Nsem-Pii TV. Your mom and boss for you. I think say Obia Nsem-Pii TV.
Entrepreneurship maybe.
Nsem-Pii. Yeah, you ask good questions. I hope sir you continue with your good questions.
Be the first to know Nsem-Pii TV.
The finest vice president, Dr. Bawumia, Ghana has ever had. And Eko Ewo Democracy Conference Ewo Nigeria. Abusiafo na wo kasa na ene. Okobo John Dramani Mahama ne chemso. One intention of extending a term of office as president to the third term. Now, no, Dr. Bawumia fears here okasa no say. Some African leaders are changing the constitution to make their term of office long, which is not the will of the people. Now, Mahama, I am so shocked, say, Bawumia can't say this because the intentions to extend the terms of office, has been so bare. I will be a canvas, and I say in term yet is a Wakote Review Committee of the Constitution. Abusiafo yanche ho kwa no de yantie ensem a Dr. Bawumia edi tudwa abranra okopie mu ewo Nigeria.
Place partisan, ethnic, and other interests over and above competence in appointments to these institutions. We are simply creating mere edifices and structures to reward cronies, creating avenues for reluctant Democrats to get a backdoor route to autocracy and misgovernance. Second, there is a growing phenomenon in our democracy whereby people deliberately run down these independent and accountability institutions purely on emotive reasons. Has been described as the year of political disruption because out of elections held in 60 countries, incumbents lost 80% of the elections, largely on account of increased cost of living following the COVID pandemic, amongst other reasons. We have seen major examples of this political disruption in countries like South Africa, the United Kingdom, the USA, Japan, India, Sierra Leone, Botswana, and Senegal, to mention a few. In Ghana, the presidential and parliamentary elections were held just last month. As an incumbent vice president, I was also the ruling party candidate for the presidency. Before the election, there was the usual anxiety expressed by the opposition as well as the diplomatic community. And we have this expression of anxiety virtually in every election. But there was this anxiety expressed by the diplomatic community and the opposition about the transparency, credibility, and fairness of the impending election. The opposition claimed that government had a plan to rig the election. I believe this is a standard claim by all opposition parties in any election in Africa. Frankly, notwithstanding the above, I, as the presidential candidate of my party, I was confident in Ghana's electoral process, as the Electoral Commission had demonstrated over time fairness and transparency. In fact, in Ghana, we spent quite a lot of time on electoral reform over the years. In addition to this, I was confident of winning the election on December 7th based on what I considered to be the solid record of achievement, notwithstanding the economic challenges we faced. However, when the polls closed on December 7th and counting began, we started receiving the results from our party's collation centers. We had set up a very elaborate scheme of collating our results, and we started receiving the results from our collation sectors. By 3 a.m. on Sunday, because the election was on Saturday, it was obvious from the data that we had received from our collation centers that my opponent, the former president and now president, John Dramani Mahama, had decisively won the election. I knew, so by 3 a.m. had begun to mount. I therefore took the decision to hold a press conference at 9 a.m. the next morning. I asked for them to call the press the next morning at 9 a.m. to concede the election to my opponent, even before the EC had announced and collated the results. You can imagine how incredulous some of even my team members were about my decision to do this. They said, we have to wait for the EC. And I said, our data collation, I believe, is correct. The EC will not have any different data from what we have collected. So I believed that my concession within 14 hours of the close of the polls was in the supreme interest of Ghana's democracy and peace. The people had decided, and we had to respect their decision without any equivocation. A politician's ambition must, and I repeat, must never supersede the interest of your nation. Ambition can always be seen for a politician in two dimensions. You have a personal ambition, but you also have an ambition for your country. Most of the time, when we talk of ambition, we are only talking about personal ambition. The ambition for the country is relegated. We don't talk about ambition. When you ask somebody what is your ambition, it's usually coming up about personal ambition. But for a politician, you face these two dimensions of ambition. The ambition for yourself and the ambition for your country. For democracy to survive and to thrive and to be strengthened, the ambition for the country must be paramount and must supersede the ambition for yourself. Ladies and gentlemen, elections are not do or die affairs. That's what we must understand. The right of the citizenry to choose leaders in a free, transparent manner is sacrosanct and remains one of the most vital anchors of a true democratic dispensation. By choosing and or changing leaders through the ballot box, though necessary, is not sufficient to guarantee a true flourishing democratic culture. Ladies and gentlemen, There are several other imperatives, including the often taken for granted issues that, when combined with peaceful and credible elections, enrich and sustain our democracy. I therefore propose to continue with the rest of my speech by looking at the common threats to our democracy, and then proceed to suggest, in my opinion, the things we can do to grow a democratic culture that is resilient enough to deliver governance, economic, and social dividends. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the most important determinants of a flourishing democracy is the quality of institutions. Institutions capable of guaranteeing rights, including property rights, and checking the wanton abuse of power. These institutions include the independent election management bodies, the judiciary, the ombudsman, the police, the other law enforcement agencies, and many others. One of the most topical issues about economic growth, and as an economist, I follow this literature closely. One of the most important topical issues about economic growth that has been extensively discussed by development economists is the now famous institutions versus geography debate. Celebrated economists like Daniel Roderick have come up to the firm conclusion that when it comes to the determinants of growth, the quality of institutions towers above everything else. Unfortunately, whilst the culture of peacefully choosing leaders is being entrenched, these institutions that should determine our growth are becoming weak and endangered. Several reasons account for this. First, when we place partisan, ethnic, and other interests over and above competence in appointments to these institutions, we are simply creating mere edifices and structures to reward cronies, creating avenues for reluctant Democrats to get a backdoor route to autocracy and misgovernance. Second, there is a growing phenomenon in our democracy whereby people deliberately run down these independent and accountability institutions purely on emotive reasons, especially when these institutions decide, as they should, to uphold the law in the interest of the masses and in strict fidelity to the law. Ladies and gentlemen, it is rather alarming that sometimes these bastardizations of the institutions are undertaken by people with loud voices, people with professional and technical pedigrees, and people who know the truth as espoused by these institutions. For these people, partisan and sectional interests are often packaged as technical and professional opinions, thereby setting up these institutions up for public ridicule, scorn, and disdain. This has often set the stage for people with no appreciation of the issues at stake to run amok, eroding public confidence in these institutions and causing substantial damage to our democracy. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I need to touch on a closely related matter to the quality of institutions. Indeed, it is an extension of that point. It is about what we used to know in the past. In times when democracy was threatened, it was usually the case that a group of people with a known leader would take up arms and assume control of state power and institutions. The group or its leader would proceed to abolish elections, ultimately collapse democracy, and declare a dictatorship. This is gradually giving way, even though a few spots still exist for this path to toppling the democratic order, as we have seen in the sub-region recently. In place of that is an orchestrated hollowing out of democratic structures and processes and taking full control of the state and related organs, making it nearly impossible for the political opposition to win elections. This is a potent way to bury democracy by placing form over substance and depriving democracy of its essential functions. Ladies and gentlemen, in other words, the form is democratic, but the substance is obdurate dictatorship. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the biggest threats to democracy today is what I call the next meal principle. Before I make my point, I need to re-echo the words of one of Africa's greatest sons, the distinguished Nelson Mandela, who said that as long as poverty, injustice, and gross inequality exist in our world, none of us can truly rest, end quote. Democracy must be a means to an end. The best democracy is the one that delivers public goods and services effectively and efficiently and creates opportunities for citizens whilst making conscious efforts to leave no one behind. For sub-Saharan Africa, the data suggests that we do not have an option to do nothing. In 2024, the World Bank estimated that 2/3 of the world's population live in extreme poverty in sub-Saharan Africa. Back home, here, the World Bank's 2024 review reveals that more than half of Nigerians live in multidimensional poverty. For Nigeria, and indeed much of sub-Saharan Africa, our work is cut out for us. We need to take decisive actions to demonstrate that to govern is to advance the interests and welfare of the people. We need to reconfigure our economic systems, processes, and institutions in a manner that prioritizes the next meal for the majority of our people. For far too long, the focus has been on ticking the boxes on democratic institutions, much to the neglect of what those institutions have been able to produce for the ordinary citizen. The person who is unable to afford the next Eba meal is unlikely to appreciate any data on democratic progress. Ladies and gentlemen, there is growing apprehension among the citizenry about the relevance and usefulness of government institutions, with many people losing faith in these institutions. This is concerning and portends a bleak future for democratic sustenance if we do not rise to the occasion, and quickly too. For our democracy to remain relevant and sustainable, actors need to ensure that citizens have confidence in the democratic system to address their needs and concerns, particularly basic needs, which I call the next meal principle. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I now turn attention to a matter right in front of us, and which we continue surprisingly to downplay. I'm talking about the youth demography, or what is known in modern speak as the Gen Z demographic.